Hello, folks. It's Neal Conlon from AppGuard. Thank you all for joining in today. I really appreciate you taking time out of your busy day to jump onto our monthly knowledge sharing webinar. So just to give you a little bit of context about the conversation that we're going to have today, when I joined the team a few months ago, I said that there was a huge disparity in the ecosystem of cybersecurity around knowledge transfer, and the purpose of these conversations that we're having once a month is really just to get really talented, sleeves up people who are in the space, who are doing really great things, just to share some of the great things they're doing and share some of the knowledge that we're doing. And so every month we're picking a topic. If you were on the one in September, we talked about Iran, and we had folks from the DHS and folks from the NSA on the call. And rolling into October, most of us are thinking about, starting to get retrospective and think about what worked, this year, what didn't work this year, and what we need to start thinking about, what we want to do next year. And that lays true for cybersecurity. And one of the things I think is one of the biggest challenges from my own point of view is really around how do you integrate cybersecurity with company culture. And a really good example of that paradigm and that challenge, just happened last week with the Facebook breach. And one of the things, if you pay attention to social media platforms, 4 or 5 months ago, Facebook started to shift their conversation and say that, they wanted to have social impact. They want to be refocus on building a community, and all these kind of culture words. But ultimately, I think that you can't create this you can't focus on social impact if the community is not safe. And with the breach of 50 million, and it probably has to be more, logins and passwords, and they still haven't released all of the information. But ultimately, I don't think a lot of people realize the ramifications of, potentially your login and password existing from Facebook, existing on other platforms, other tools. So this week, I really wanted to focus on, the critical areas that CISOs and information security folks need to be thinking about. Whereas what worked in 2018, what didn't work in 2018, and then what they need to be focused on, going into the new year. So I'm super excited because we've got Donald Welch, who's the CISO over at Penn State, and then we've got Tony Cruz, who's a veteran like myself, a hard-charging cyber guy. I'll let them both do little introductions here in a second, but I think it's really great that we're bringing two different industries and two different perspectives to this conversation. So thank you both for being on the panel today. So why don't we do this? Donald, why don't you give us a quick little bio on yourself, and then Tony, you right afterwards.
Sure. So I retired from the Army in 2004. I was a professor and CIO at West Point is my last assignment. And while there, friends of mine and I developed the cybersecurity program for cadets. I went into the commercial world, worked at a retailer for a while, then was the CEO of a network, IT services, and security company. And then I was the CISO at University of Michigan, and I'm now the CISO at Penn State.
Nice. Tony, how about you?
Hi, thanks, Neal. So I retired out of the Army in 2016, where I last served at Army Cyber Command and the NSA, building cyberspace capabilities and conducting operations for what's obviously been happening with nation-state actors against DoD systems. Right after that, I went into the private sector at Bank of America, where I spent the majority of my time in the Global Information Security Division, evaluating emerging technology, whether that's blockchain, whether that's a new application provided by some third party, or where that was a cloud service provider. And then I went back to government, to the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, to provide strategic cybersecurity consulting, for lack of a better term, to energy industry partners regarding the threats that they are facing by advanced persistent threats. So just transition out of that. So in the middle of going back to the private sector, and I'll be updating you guys on my new role here shortly.
Got it. Okay. Well, definitely thank you both for your service, and definitely appreciate having folks with a high caliber of knowledge base and background. That's really what we want to provide here, is alternative perspectives, but coming from industry experts. So I really appreciate that. So let's dig right in. And for the folks that are on the webinar, if they have questions, you can type them into the chat, and then just so we can be conscious of everyone's time, we'll go through the list of questions at the end of the webinar. So let's just dig right in. Maybe let's start with you, Donald. The first question I would say, like 2018, right? There's a lot has gone on in the world of cybersecurity. The government just put out a new cyber strategy last week. In your opinion, what do you think are the things that are working in our favor for 2018? Like, what worked well this year, in your opinion?
Sorry, for across the industry or for Penn State specifically?
I'm happy to get your perspective on either or both.
Okay, so at Penn State, one of the things that we have just done is implemented a SIM, and have been both bringing in an awful lot of information. We did an enterprise license with our vendor, so really our only limitation is the hardware we can put underneath it. And then really emphasizing the training development, getting my team to talk to other teams, to bring in the expertise and experience from other teams, and I think most importantly, to layer on top of that automation. So as you can imagine, so we have about 20 million different events coming in to Penn State every day, with 120,000 users and a very large network. So the kind of sorting through that and being able to look across all our disparate systems, and especially to put some automation to it. So what we've seen is by really emphasizing this and bringing in all the different data sources, we have been able to identify and stop intrusions along their kill chain before they had damage done, and been able to show concrete what the attacker was lining up to steal in terms of money or intellectual property that we were able to demonstrate that they weren't. So that was a big payoff. So really emphasizing on that, to bring in all those different tools to try and look across our 84 different IT organizations and get that picture, but also for those tasks where we could, to automate the response so that we could stop some of these before they get started.
Got it. That makes complete sense. Tony, how about you? Either in your roles this year, or maybe even in the ecosystem and industry, what do you think were some of the things that worked well for 2018?
For me, I think overall across industry is the situational awareness of what's happening, right, with not just cybersecurity, but data integrity and privacy protection. So if you look at what happened with Facebook, if you you've seen what's happening in the press with U.S. energy providers, with advanced persistent threats trying to infiltrate their systems, and whether that's to do immediate damage or hold at risk for the future. I think that's the biggest thing that's come out of the whole Facebook situation, and even post election meddling. It's hey, companies or entities, what are you doing with your data? How are you protecting it? How are you maintaining system integrity? How are you maintaining data integrity? I think that's the biggest key takeaway.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. And just to throw in a comment there, I think from my perspective, I speak to, probably dozens of CISOs every week. Last week alone, I spoke to 35. And I think vendor fatigue is like a real challenge right now for a lot of CISOs, and it's just the opportunity to have a successful business is absolutely out there, because this is a growing challenge that is going to continue, but ultimately there's just so many vendors that are tackling these challenges from so many different angles, and the problem just hasn't changed, right? Like the countermeasures and the way that it's being addressed is evolving every 3 or 4 months. Gartner said that 6 months after a new capability is deployed, a new tool, a new software, a new AI, a new machine learning, within 6 months there will be a countermeasure developed that can break it, hack it, shut it down in some way. But ultimately, I feel for a lot of CISOs and C-level people, because beyond the logo, it's hard, unless you're a very technical savvy person, to understand really what it is that we're trying to do. And ultimately, it always boils down to 3 components, which is obviously we want to maintain integrity of the infrastructure and security, but also there is the financial cost of what it costs. We don't want to put a $5,000 alarm system on a $200 Buick that we bought from a used car lot, which tends to be where some of this stuff is kind of headed. So we need to, as a vendor, we need to address that, in 2019. So, okay, so for 2018, what are some of the risks? What are some of the challenges? What are some of the things that people may or may not be thinking about that they need to just be aware of? Like, what were the challenges for cybersecurity in 2018? Let's go reverse, Tony. What do you think? What do you think of some of the pain points for 2018 for cyber?
Well, just to add on to what you just said, I think some of the pain points are, hey, what I have deployed in my network, is it enough? Right. A lot of folks are looking internally, and they're looking real hard at just their controls, for their cybersecurity controls and data controls, data loss prevention, and then just increasingly reputational risk, right, is a big thing these days. I mean, if you look at Google and some of the firms here out in Silicon Valley, they're being called up to Congress, and now people are saying, okay, are you guys going to be increasingly regulated? What does this mean to your business? Right? Because when Congress starts asking questions and summoning people, then that's usually what happens. So I think we'll see a lot of that carry over into 2019, as we get more and more press reporting and intelligence community reporting that's released to the public regarding what nation states and criminal actors are doing. We have an election coming up, so I think we're going to see more of the status quo.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. Donald, how about you? What do you think?
So I think in in IT overall and in security, the more things change, the more they remain the same. I still see problems with the basics. We're not patching our systems. We're not writing secure software. We're not, paying enough attention to the fundamentals. And this was a problem 20 years ago, and it's still a problem. In a lot of industries, extra money spent on security doesn't necessarily give you a competitive advantage unless a disaster strikes your competitor. So it's difficult to determine whether you're spending $5,000 to protect that $200 Buick or not. And if we understood that better, we might be able to make better decisions. But overall, that's still difficult. Most IT organizations have a lot of technical debt, and they're trying to dig out from underneath that. And unfortunately, a lot of that technical debt brings increased risk due to cyber attack. The other thing that I think we're not doing well is many times we buy some pretty cool technology, and we put only enough effort into it to maybe leverage a quarter to a third of its capabilities, and we kind of stop and move on to the next thing. I think that we in the security industry could do a better job of really fully leveraging our tools. A lot of the tools that we have are pretty good, and you probably see this more than I do, but in talking with my peers, we really don't fully leverage them. I talked about our success with a SIM and how we talk to a lot of peers. Higher ed is nice because we collaborate quite frequently and quite openly. And I'm surprised how where a lot of teams stop in leveraging their SIM, and they just enough to get it going, and then there aren't training dollars. They don't go to the conferences. They kind of just keep things on autopilot. So I think that those kind of fundamentals are one of the big challenges. And the other thing that I see going forward is the understanding of cybersecurity risk as an organizational-wide risk versus an IT risk. A lot of organizations, and especially higher education organizations, still think of cybersecurity as an IT risk and will try to address it as such, as opposed to an organizational-wide risk. And I think if you're operating from that kind of perspective, you're basically fighting with one arm tied behind your back. And so hopefully the kinds of exposures that you're talking about, the benefits of those bad things happening, is that leaders from all kinds of organizations will understand that this is an institutional risk and not an IT risk.
Sure.
Neal, if I can add on to what Donald said.
Go for it.
I'd like to add one more point and say that as I was talking to a lot of people, both in financial services and the energy industry, I always tell them, to add on to what Donald said, is cybersecurity is a business decision. If you're not looking at cybersecurity as a business decision, you're most likely not allocating the proper resources, as Donald said, and you're not exercising your staff the way you should be, and all of those second and third order effects. So it affects the outcomes of your quarterly or annual performance and things of that nature. So a lot of folks need to remember that, or realize that cybersecurity is a business decision at the end of the day.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and I think even more so because I think the industry has done a pretty decent job of improving the number of like viruses that get deployed. Right, we don't hear a lot, or we don't hear as many virus and I guess virus stuff happening as we did a couple years ago. but now the ecosystem has shifted where, malware and now ransomware is the big one. I think that changes this whole understanding of what we're really trying to secure, because it's not so much about being an IT decision, because I think when it was a virus thing, the virus comes into the infrastructure. It's an IT risk, it's an IT decision, it's an IT budget. But now with ransomware and going after the business, hacktivists, as well as state nations and insider threat stuff, the paradigm just has to shift to exactly your points around this is a business decision. This is not about hardware or software. It's about a framework, and it is about how we're going to react to when it happens, because the CFO of the company or even your grandmother could get an email and think she's supposed to be doing something, clicking on something, and then unknowingly let something into a personal or business infrastructure that could be dormant, a weaponized document. It just goes on, right? And we're even seeing. I mean, if you look at the ecosystem, you look at companies. I'll just name a couple, and this is not meant to be like an advertisement at all, but AIG, which is the largest insurance company in the world, now offers a cyber solution for a cyber software for its clients called AIG Edge. AppGuard does have clients that are white labeling the software, and they are giving it away to users to protect their infrastructure, because there are these big there's colleges and big banking platforms and all these different communities out there that have users who are not employees that are dependent on getting into the infrastructure in order for them to facilitate their education or to facilitate transactions. And in a BYOD environment, they're ultimately going to inadvertently probably click on something and let something into the infrastructure, and that's a big challenge. So okay, so really appreciate the things that were good for 2018, things that are not so good for 2018. Let's talk like future, right? Like let's talk like what are the big things. And I think Tony hit on one, and Donald hit on one that I just want to voice. That obviously there's another election coming up, and I think people understand what that means for them. I think this Facebook breach thing is going to go on for a little bit and be a problem for some people and for some companies. And Don said, I think something people don't realize is the number of events that go on in some of these businesses every day. I think you said, I don't remember the numbers you said, but you said you have 120,000 users. So, if every average person sends 10 emails a day, that's millions of events going on a day, and that's millions of opportunities for risk to happen. So for 2019, what do you think folks need to be focused on? What's coming next for either your industry or for your businesses?
So this is Don, and you mentioned ransomware, and that is obviously a big fear. We find it, still going on and hitting a lot of damage. So the just basic business continuity and disaster recovery. The making sure that we can recover quickly from anything, but the prominent example, of course, is obviously a ransomware attack, is really important. After 9/11, everybody hit DR and to a lesser extent BC types of operations, but I have found people have not paid as much attention to it, and the idea of offline backups maybe isn't as powerful as it should be, and people are being surprised with ransomware attacks that either the backups don't work, they didn't have key pieces of the infrastructure backed up, et cetera. And so that's a big point of emphasis for me.
Sure, sure. And how about from your perspective, Tony?
Yeah, to second Don, the ransomware, disaster recovery, but also just the system and data integrity. A lot of people have in the past have focused on, from a technical perspective, on perimeter defense, right? They're trying to catch 100% of the threats coming through or attempting to come through their firewall through the wire. I think people are now shifting and realizing that that's impossible. So assume that they're going to get through, right? That a threat actor is going to get through, and focus on maintaining the integrity of your systems, but most importantly, your data, because that's what's being weaponized these days, is the data retained on these systems, whether weaponizing the data, damaging the data, erasing the data, holding you at ransom for your own data. So I think the focus around data, not just in 2019, but in 2020, as that, as that grows as a business, not just the United States, but around the world, I think that's going to be the most important piece.
Sure, absolutely, and I agree with both of your statements there. I mean, especially the data point. Last night I was at a cybersecurity event, and one of the topics they were discussing was, if you went back even as recent as 6 years ago, you could have a company that sold some widget, whether you sold cars, coffee mugs, I don't know, shirts, whatever, and that's what the company was valued on basically the number of widgets, the number of units they could sell, and now in a very short span of time, through digital transformation, initiatives, almost every company is becoming a technology company, and it becomes about obviously the data and becomes about their infrastructure and the backbone of their infrastructure. And there are technology companies who just happen to sell widgets, and the human error is the problem, because many of these people who used to sell or be responsible for business decisions on selling some unit of a product or a unit of service are not, trained well enough, savvy enough to understand that there is all this cyber risk that goes on now, and it becomes about this defense in depth. It becomes about, even if you have a 6-foot fence around your house, do you still need to have a door on your house? Well, absolutely. Well, does that door need to have a lock? Do you need to have windows when you get in the house? Do you need to have locks on your safe? So that even if somebody, in this case, a threat actor, is able to scale your fence and get into the house, they're still not going to get into your most prized possessions, which is very, very important. So definitely appreciate that. What do you guys see around new technologies, like the real far out futuristic stuff? I know there's a lot of documentation and cool things coming out around behavioral monitoring, as well as machine learning, and different types of pattern for identity management. And then obviously, there's lots of interesting ways of new perimeter defense that's going on. But what are you seeing? What else is out there that is the hot new shiny object for cyber?
So this is Don. So thinking way out there, Where I think we've got to go is we've got to automate our responses more and use AI to do that. So we already know bad guys are automating their attacks so that they're progressing through the kill chain much faster than we're used to seeing. And in some cases, they're using machine learning or other artificial intelligence type techniques to put logic in there to make these attacks more adaptable and effective. And I think the only way we can really counter that is we need similar types of tools who can recognize when an intrusion is occurring and react to it faster than a human analyst can. And so what we're really going to need to do is evolve our workforce so that instead of someone who's really good at, getting a feeling about this alert and tracking it down and identifying an intrusion and then being able to sever the kill chain, we're going to have people who are better at manipulating the interface to these advanced tools. And the skills are not necessarily the same. And I heard a study around chess players, and that when you have chess players playing each other who can use computer programs to assist them, the winners were not necessarily the best chess players per se, but they were the people who mastered the interface. And I think we will have a similar type of environment that the old skills of being able to do things yourself will be important to create the tools, but then it's going to be the masters of the tools who are going to populate our SOCs and IR teams and be able to combat these new threats.
Sure. No, absolutely. Tony, how about you?
I second Don. I think that AI or ML infused cyber defense, specifically when it comes to malware and other types of worms, attempting to be pushed by threat actors towards defended networks. I think that's going to be absolutely key. I mean, we've exceeded a point where the average person can actually synthesize the amount of data being thrown at them, whether that's alerts, whether that's new tactics, techniques, and procedures, whatever the case. It's already data overload. I also second Donald on the fact that I think your cybersecurity professional is going to require more of the soft skills that have not been focused on in the last decade, right? We've all been focused on hard technical skills. I think soft skills are going to come back into play. Critical thinking, structured analysis of data, things like that. And that's going to be the primary requirement for folks operating these tools, or as Donald said, being the masters of these tools. So I agree 100%.
Sure. Interestingly enough, and maybe it's the way I'm framing out the questions, but there was a CISO that I spoke to that's going to be on our next panel in November, and while we were talking last week, we had a conversation about social engineering, and I think it's interesting that neither one of you, and I'm not poking on it, but it's interesting that neither one of you brought up at this point in our conversation social engineering, which is a very, very, very complex conversation, and it's also, I think, one of probably the biggest challenges because it is tied into Tony's point about soft skills, and it ties into social media, and it ties into logins and passwords, and then it just feeds all the way through to ransomware and phishing tools. And the other crazy piece that just ties into social engineering is you don't need to be a hacker, or you don't need to have programming skills any longer in order to be a good hacker. For about $40, you can go onto many websites and download, password crack, password jailbreak password stuff. You can download pieces of ransomware. You can even build a landing page that looks just like a multi-factor authentication scenario, and you can just go and deploy a bunch of that stuff on your own for about $40. And I think that's a very risky thing that people need to be aware of. Is it does not take a nation state or an anonymous organization in order to make these things happen. It just becomes a matter of someone who's got a malicious intent. I mean, it's cyber terrorism is definitely becoming a rampant thing, because you do not need to be an expert to do this, but you need to be an expert to do your best to protect against it. Okay, so let me put you guys on the spot here for a second, and what do you think are what are the three biggest concerns that you think people outside of your space need to be concerned about, like in 2019? Is it for me, right? I think the Facebook breach is a really big problem, because how many Facebook users used their password for Facebook, or used Facebook single sign-on, and then used that Facebook single sign-on for hundreds of other platforms, or use that Facebook password for their work password for email as well. I think that's going to be a big problem for a while. I think GDPR is going to be a problem for people to implement because of the cost of it. I think that's something people need to be aware of. And then the third thing I think that people need to be cautious of is, endpoint bloat, because some of these cyber stacks are just getting so large with, 20, 30 agents on the endpoint. It's just creating a house of cards that's just going to topple down at some point. So for you guys, what do you think are as my examples, what are three things that you think people need to be looking out for in the industry?
So I'll address yours and see if I can riff off those. Yep, the Facebook breach is going to be a problem, as these large, like the Yahoo breach and otherwise, where those passwords are out there. And, I don't know how many thousands of times I've told groups and individuals not to reuse their password. And, I know that effectiveness is probably less than 1%. So yeah, that's going to be a problem. And so I think one of the, and it's not just Facebook, but it certainly highlights that we really need to be looking at user behavior. And there are intrusions on people's perceptions of privacy when you're looking at it. But when someone takes over the account and starts doing things that are unusual, it's nice to be able to identify that and at least flag it, if not stop it before the damage is done. I'll actually take exception to GDPR. We've implemented GDPR here. If you are not someone whose business model is to monetize information about individuals, GDPR is really not that onerous. It has provisions for information that you have to keep for your contractual or business-related purposes. It requires that you protect your information, but we've already had that for a very long time, and some of us even have done our best to protect that information. And then in terms of the endpoint bloat, I would tend to agree with you as we move more and more towards an encrypted internet. Then if we don't decrypt at the firewall, we can't look at that traffic and find malicious connections coming into our network. So really, we've got to put more and more detection on the endpoint. and that creates a huge amount of log data. You have to protect that endpoint better. And once again, I think you've got to focus on anomalous behavior as opposed to just specific technical indicators.
Sure, absolutely. Tony, over to you.
Yeah, and both what you and Donald said, behavior analytics is going to be key. It's a lot of the recent conversations that I've had with different entities, especially in the energy sector, regarding data integrity has definitely involved behavior analytics and just being able to observe how that data is being moved and used around in and around the network, right? Or even sense outside of the network, and being able to capture that data. And as Donald said, not just look at the logs themselves, but see how people are accessing the data, or different flags for what should not be done with the data. So I think that's going to be critical. And back to what we've been saying throughout our conversation, what's been happening since the elections, and then with a lot of these data monetizing entities such as Facebook out in Silicon Valley, I think that's going to bring a lot of scrutiny to what's happening with what companies are doing with data that belongs to them or that doesn't belong to them.
Sure.
And how it's being protected and et cetera, and so on and so forth. So
yeah, no, that makes complete sense. Absolutely. And I mean, I think that ties into the need for a more more stringent zero trust framework. I like to refer to it as almost zero trust, because zero would just be very hard to manage altogether. But it's just a matter of if there's if there's an admin, a system admin who his login is in a segment of the infrastructure that it's never been in before, like somebody should be raising that as a question, just why that happened, and whether it's legitimate or not. The cost of preventative maintenance with zero trust is always going to be less expensive than the remediation is in the long term. So I got a couple questions coming in here into my chat, and I wanted to make sure that we get through them. These are a couple really good questions, actually. The first question is from Michelle, and she's asking, what do you think the KPI metrics should be to measure a CISO success? And then she puts a comment in here. Obviously, we don't want to be breached, but how do we measure success from a metrics perspective?
So if I had the answer, I'd probably be retired on a beach right now. I think that's, it's one of these things. How do you measure a negative, or, measure progress towards a negative? And it's something that I've been wrestling with, and I haven't found a satisfactory answer. So obviously, when I'm reporting metrics to my board, we do report the number of compromises, the compromised accounts, the compromised systems, and so forth. And what they really care about, I don't have to report to them. They're the things that get us in the press, get us fines, and so forth. And so, you don't have enough of those that I think you get a meaningful, if you do have enough of those, you're probably not in your job, but to get a meaningful KPI that'll track your progress. So I use, depending on what I'm trying to emphasize, I use a lot of metrics around how quickly we patch our systems, I use some subjective evaluations like process maturity, sometimes made by outside evaluators. We'll benchmark ourselves against other Big Ten universities. We share our information so that we can do that. That might be harder in industries that are more private about their information. So pretty much an unsatisfactory answer, but the way I think about it is, what is the message that I'm trying to convey to someone, be it our board of trustees, leadership of the university, deans in our colleges, IT people, or whatever? What metric will resonate with them and help tell that story that I'm trying to tell? And I think overall, the idea is that things that people do are fairly complex, and it's relatively hard to come up with a number that captures all the activity that we want to actually characterize, but ones that are representative, and we can demonstrate that, yeah, this is probably a pretty good indicator that we're doing the right thing or the wrong thing.
Got it. And Tony, how about you?
I think for me, it depends on the priorities of the organization. From a technical perspective, I think whether that's, as Don said, that's patch management, right? If a CISO walks into an organization brand new, conducts their 30 to 90 day evaluation along with their senior leadership team, and they say, the biggest problem that we have is around managing the updates to, 2,000 applications that we're running in our environment. If that's what matters, I think if those are the problems, then I think that's what should be the KPIs. However, I also say that, the CISOs, if they do not have the business leader support, and I'm not talking about just the board level, I'm talking about, parallel business leaders. So think of, a good example is Bank of America has 8 lines of businesses. The CISO has to be able to support all of those lines of businesses, and so does global information security. If the CISO does not have the support from those business leaders and the information security professionals do not have the support from the folks within the business that they work with every day, I think information security as a whole will not be successful, no matter how good or bad of a caliber of a CISO that you have in the seat. I think that's extremely critical, having the support and the backing of business leaders.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. Absolutely. Great answers. Appreciate that. Again, if anyone else has any other questions, feel free to chat them in on the GoToWebinar, and we've got 10 more minutes. I've got 2 more questions to get through here, and I'll from folks on the webinar, and if you add yours, I'll do my best to get through them. So Tony, your ending there was great to tie into this next question. This is from Stephanie. Stephanie is asking, in the C-suite, who should be the titles of the executives that should be at the table for deciding the company's cyber strategy? So if I could take a stab at that one, because it's worded a little different. I think that's a challenging one depending on the size of your organization. But there's obviously the compliance factor, the costs of the CFO, and then obviously the CTO, and then obviously the CISO. That's just from my perspective. But I guess for Donald and for Tony, who are the players at the table that should be responsible for making building the cyber strategy and checking all the boxes?
So I'll go ahead and go. So I think, overall, the CISO should own the cybersecurity strategy. if the CISO is truly a C-level leader, and I think we gave the title before we actually, in most organizations, elevate the CISO to that C-level leadership. So in those organizations where the CISO does not report to the CIO, I think that's the appropriate place for it. If the CISO reports to the CIO, and assuming the CIO is at the senior leadership level of the organization, then probably the CIO needs to be the one who pushed that strategy forward, although you'd like to think the CISO is the one who best understands security and the way the IT processes interact with the business processes and how to effectively secure them to hit the right risk level, and would be driving that. But that credibility is important, and if you're not at the senior leadership level as a CISO, the other senior people probably aren't going to think of you as a business leader. They're going to think of you purely as a security leader.
I agree with that. I think, either the CIO or the CTO, however the organization is structured, either way, the CISO is taking the initiatives of the CIO and the CTO and the board of directors and implementing that through a plan that they will build for the rest of the to defend the organization. But yeah, it should be the CISO developing that, and also the CISO should be constantly interfacing not with just the CIO or the CTO, but if not on the board itself, talking to the rest of the board members, because if there's no business leader support, then the CISO is likely going to fail.
Yep. Definitely agree there. So okay, I've got about 6 more minutes left. I want to be conscious of time here, and I've got one more question. Which one? So this question is for a non-Fortune 1000 company. What do you think the biggest threat vector is? And then Michael asks, do we need to be more concerned about nation states, hacktivists, or rogue threat actors? Which one do you think for non, Fortune 1000 companies, where should they be putting all of their bets on? Do they try to stop nation states or hacktivists or other? I guess is really what the question is. What do you guys think on your end?
So I'll go again. So clearly, for anyone, criminals who are out trying to steal money, I think, are the most common threat that we see, and they attack large and small organizations, and in simple and complex ways. The one thing I will say is, 20 years ago, I taught an undergraduate course in which I had my non-computer science students develop a cyber operations plan to support a conventional plan. And one of the things we had them do is go out and analyze industries in the company where they're planning the operation, and determine how to further our national goals by impacting those industries. And in many cases, you could go for this well-defended target to try and inflict some collateral pain on an adversary, or you could hit these numerous small, soft targets, and it's a great thing about computers, it allows you to scale, and cause the same kind of pain, right? So, you could take out ExxonMobil, who's probably pretty well defended, or you could take out every mom and pop gas station in a region and you get the same effect. So I think you can't ignore nation states, but, in a realistic sense, I think your number one priority is going to be keeping your company in business and trying to stop cyber criminals.
Sure. Tony, how about you?
I also say cyber criminals, but I think whether you're a Fortune 100, 1000 or not, I think an evaluation of what your critical assets are. So you could be, as Donald was saying, you could be a local utility company that's providing power to a military installation that's running some type of top secret, program on the installation. Now, you wouldn't consider yourself, well, why would they come after me? Look at the critical assets within your organization and the ones that you're tied to. And I think that would better help you define what you should be focused on.
Right. No, completely agreed there. Well, okay, so we've got no more questions coming in. Definitely appreciate having both of you on this call. Appreciate that a large majority of the folks that tuned in for this conversation stayed throughout it. And if anybody has any follow-up questions that they would like to ask either of these two gentlemen, please do email them in, and I will make sure that we get them in front of them and get you connected to those people to answer those questions. And we'll be doing another one. Doing another one of these on the same topic in 2 weeks with some different panelists to get some other perspectives. So if you would like to tune in for that one, we'll make sure to get an invite out for that one. And if there's other folks that you'd like to invite that could see value in it or get value from it, we will absolutely appreciate having those folks tune in as well. So thank you both, and thanks everybody, and everybody have a productive day, and stay safe out there.
Yeah, thanks, Tony and Neal.
Thank you.